There's a tense atmosphere building in Côte d'Ivoire right now. This is President Alassane Ouattara. He's 83 years old and he's gearing up for a fourth term in October 2025 after removing term limits back in 2016. That decision has left the country deeply polarized. Now, to make things worse, key opposition figures have been barred from running in this election. That move has triggered protests in the streets and a growing distrust in the country's democratic institutions. But here's the real question. How did we get here? Because to understand what's really happening in this West African country, we have to go back to the deals, the alliances, and the power structures that have quietly shaped Côte d'Ivoire for more than 60 years. This is the story of the secret cabal that owns Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire's modern story cannot be understood without its colonial prelude. As part of French West Africa, the territory was governed under direct French rule that sought to control everything from politics to culture. The French justified colonization with a civilizing mission, but in reality, they were driven by economic and geopolitical motives, exploiting Ivory Coast's rich resources, that is, ivory, cocoa, coffee, and timber. These early days saw repressive colonial policies such as forced labor and heavy taxation. For roughly 60 years, Côte d'Ivoire was part of this oppressive French colonial empire. Its economy continued to serve Paris. By the mid-20th century, the people grew tired and frustrated. An Ivorian independence movement was formed, led by figures like Félix Houphouët-Boigny, a Western-educated doctor turned politician. Houphouët-Boigny founded the Syndicat Agricole Africain in 1944 and co-founded the Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire in 1946, rallying farmers and intellectuals against colonial exploitation. He successfully pushed France to abolish forced labor in 1946 and became a leading voice for autonomy. However, rather than a violent uprising, Côte d'Ivoire's path to independence was negotiated politically within the framework of the French Union. What many didn't realize at the time was that these negotiations were dubious at best and meant to preserve the French military and economic privileges in the newly sovereign nation. You see, during this period, France cultivated a loyal Ivorian elite, none more influential than this guy, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. Even though he had started as a champion for African farmers, helping to end forced labor in the 1940s, by the late 1950s, he had chosen a different strategy. Not confrontation, but close cooperation with France. Even before independence was finalized, Houphouët-Boigny was already aligning Côte d'Ivoire with Western interests. He worked closely with Jacques Foccart, the man who designed France's post-colonial Africa policy, and together they helped create La France Afrique, an informal but powerful network that kept former colonies in France's political and economic orbit. By 1959, Houphouët helped establish a bloc of pro-West African states intended to counter the more radical Pan-African leaders like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sékou Touré. So, when Côte d'Ivoire declared independence on August 7, 1960, it wasn't a clean break. Houphouët-Boigny became the first president and immediately signed agreements that allowed French troops to stay in the country. He kept the national currency tied to the French treasury and embedded French advisors all through his government. This arrangement delivered results, at least on the surface. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Côte d'Ivoire was hailed as an African success story. The Ivorian miracle saw the economy grow rapidly, fueled by high cocoa and coffee prices and heavy French investment. Abidjan became known as the Paris of West Africa, with a skyline and infrastructure that stood out in the region. But this prosperity came with strings attached. Thousands of French nationals occupied key posts in the civil service and business sector, ensuring policy stayed aligned with French interests. Houphouët-Boigny ruled as an unchallenged strongman. Opposition parties were banned until 1990. Dissent was tightly controlled, and political power remained concentrated among loyalists, often from his own Baoulé ethnic group. This concentration of power reinforced the arrangement with France. In exchange for political stability and open markets, Paris provided military protection. investment, and diplomatic support. From the very start, Côte d'Ivoire's sovereignty was conditional. The political and economic framework established in 1960 would become the operating system of the country, one that allowed it to prosper, but also kept it firmly within a network of foreign influence that still shapes its politics today. And the man behind all of these arrangements was this guy, Felix Houphouët-Boigny.
In that it marks the fact that my country has firmly embarked on a policy of full cooperation with all democratic nations working for the happiness of mankind.
From the outside, Felix Houphouët-Boigny looked like the model African leader. He brought his country independence without a war, kept it stable for more than 3 decades, and turned it into one of the fastest growing economies in the developing world. But inside the system he built, stability was tightly linked to loyalty, and that loyalty was rewarded as long as it is aligned with Western interest. You see, Houphouët-Boigny was not just president of Côte d'Ivoire, he was a key player in the Cold War chess game across Africa. Through his friendship with Francis Jacques Foucault, he became a trusted ally for Paris and, by extension, Washington. The understanding was clear. Côte d'Ivoire would be a base of operations for Western influence in West Africa. This meant Houphouët's government often worked to undermine leaders in the region who stepped outside the Western orbit. In Ghana, he supported moves against Kwame Nkrumah, providing a staging ground for operations that contributed to the 1966 coup. In Guinea, he backed an armed proxy force against Sékou Touré after Touré rejected France's post-colonial terms. In Benin, he was linked to a failed 1977 mercenary coup against Marxist leader Mathieu Kérékou. And in Burkina Faso, his close ally Blaise Compaoré overthrew and killed Thomas Sankara in 1987, an event Sankara's supporters still view as an assassination backed by foreign and Ivorian interest. Houphouët's reach extended beyond West Africa. In the 1980s, he supported Jonas Savimbi's UNITA rebels in Angola, siding with the US and South Africa against the Soviet-backed government. In Liberia, his government gave Charles Taylor's rebels money and weapons as they fought to overthrow Samuel Doe, a move motivated partly by personal ties and by geopolitical alignment. These were not isolated events. They were part of a pattern. Côte d'Ivoire was the dependable launchpad for Western-friendly interventions in Africa. And at home, Houphouët ran the country as a one-party state, banning opposition and keeping power within a tight circle of allies. Southern ethnic groups, especially his Baoulé people, dominated politics, while northern Muslim communities were pushed to the margins. Opposition voices were silenced or co-opted. Houphouët's government was riddled with nepotism and elitism, symbolized by grand projects like transferring the capital to his home village, Yamoussoukro, and constructing the world's largest basilica there. Beneath the surface, there was a deeply rooted corruption that largely went unpunished so long as the economy boomed. Crucially though, the Houphouët-Boigny era entrenched French neocolonial influence. The Ivorian economy remained tightly tied to France. French banks and companies dominated key industries in the 1960s. On the surface, the country was booming. Skyscrapers in Abidjan, highways to the interior, record cocoa exports, but this system was built to keep both domestic and regional politics in line with the same network of power. And that network didn't just survive the Cold War, it adapted to the New World Order, an order that became necessary with the Cold War ending. By the late 1980s, the shine of this Ivorian miracle was starting to fade. For nearly 3 decades, Felix Houphouët-Boigny had kept Côte d'Ivoire stable, profitable, and tightly aligned with France. But the same structures that delivered growth also made the country vulnerable. And when the global economy shifted, those weaknesses came into view. The boom years had been built on high prices for cocoa and coffee. When those prices collapsed in the 1980s, government revenues plunged. The country's heavy dependence on these two commodities and the new colonial arrangements controlling them left little room to maneuver. Debt mounted, and by the end of the decade, Côte d'Ivoire was forced to suspend payments and impose austerity. Meanwhile, Houphouët's style of governance, which is this one-party rule, passionate networks, and an economy dominated by foreign companies had concentrated wealth and power at the top. Corruption scandals became harder to ignore. In 1983, university professors launched a major strike after the government, under pressure from the World Bank to cut spending, abruptly cancelled their housing allowances. This rare challenge to Houphouët's rule escalated into a broad protest movement joined by students, teachers, and professionals, alleging that austerity was unfair when officials were embezzling funds. The regime responded with a mix of repression and co-optation. Security forces broke up demonstrations, but Houphouët also promised to investigate corruption to placate public anger. The result was the country's first ever high-profile anti-corruption crackdown, a sensational housing scandal trial in 1984 that gripped the nation. Dozens of officials, including ministers and even French expatriate contractors, were prosecuted for stealing millions from state housing programs. For example, one connected insider billed the state over $1 million for a single door frame and key. This case of the century, as local media dubbed it, was Houphouët's warning to his fat cat elite that times had changed. Ivorians were shocked at revelations of fictitious housing projects, inflated rents, and lavish kickbacks fueling the lifestyles of the well-connected few. For many Ivorians, it was a symbol of how far the political elite had drifted from everyday realities. The social contract that had kept the peace was breaking down. Economic hardship sharpened ethnic and regional divides. Northern Muslim communities, already marginalized, began to voice their exclusion more openly. Southerners, who had once been unwavering in their support, started questioning the government's priorities. Ultimately, the 1980s economic crisis and corruption outrage forced political reforms. In 1990, facing strikes and riots by civil servants and students fed up with institutional corruption, Houphouët-Boigny agreed to introduce multi-party democracy. For the first time, opposition parties were legalized and a contested presidential election was held in 1990. Of course, Houphouët won that election amid allegations of irregularities, but the genie was out of the bottle and Ivorians now demanded greater accountability. The era of complacent one-party rule was drawing to a close as Houphouët aged and the public grew restless for a change. By the time Houphouët-Boigny eventually died in 1993, he left behind not just a political vacuum, but a nation whose stability had always been more fragile than it looked. The carefully managed order of the Cold War years was about to collide with new pressures, which are multi-party politics, identity-based nationalism, and a public no longer willing to accept the old bargain. Félix Houphouët-Boigny's death in December 1993 marked the end of a political era. His 33 years rule in Côte d'Ivoire, blending patronage and foreign partnerships, had kept the country stable. But that stability had been personal. It depended on him. Without Houphouët, the carefully balanced system began to wobble. The presidency passed to Henry Konan Bedie, the longtime Speaker of Parliament and Houphouët's political protege. Bedie inherited a country under pressure. Debt was high, the cocoa economy was still vulnerable, and the public was demanding more democratic openness. However, instead of building a broad coalition, Bedie turned to divisive identity politics. His tool was Ivorite, a political doctrine that claimed to define who was a true Ivorian. In practice, it excluded many northern citizens and people with immigrant origins from neighboring Burkina Faso and Mali. The most high-profile target was this guy, Alassane Ouattara, a Muslim northerner and former prime minister whose family background was used to question his nationality. Under the Ivorite rules, Ouattara was barred from running for president. Thousands of other residents, some who had lived in Côte d'Ivoire for decades, faced discrimination or expulsion. Bedie's government became known not just for xenophobia but for deepening corruption. The economy, which had briefly recovered after a 1994 devaluation of the CFA franc, started to stagnate yet again. Foreign donors, uncomfortable with his exclusionary policies, began reducing aid. Discontent grew in the streets and in the military. On Christmas Eve 1999, this discontent boiled over. General Robert Gué, a former army chief, led a coup that toppled Bela's government. Soldiers accused him of corruption and injustice, and for the very first time since independence, Côte d'Ivoire's leadership changed at gunpoint. The coup sent shockwaves all through West Africa. Since independence, Houphouët had kept the military out of politics. Now, that firewall was gone, and in a sign of changing times, France, once quick to defend its allies, did not intervene to save Bela. Some saw that as Paris quietly acknowledging that the old order had run its course. General Gué promised to fight corruption and restore democracy, but his next moves would show that in Côte d'Ivoire, promises of reform were often just the opening act in a much longer drama. When General Robert Gué seized power in December 1999, he promised Ivorians a break from corruption and a rapid return to democracy. But like so many transitional leaders in West Africa at the time, he quickly showed signs of wanting to keep the presidency for himself. The first real test came in the October 2000 presidential election. Gué's government barred the two most prominent political figures, Henry Konan Bedi, the ousted president, and Alassane Ouattara, still disqualified under the Ivorite rules. That left the race between Gué himself and opposition leader Laurent Gbagbo, a long-time dissident and historian who had spent years in exile and prison under Houphouët-Boigny's regime. As votes were counted, early tallies showed Gbagbo ahead. Gué's camp quickly stalled the process and declared him the winner, but Ivorians didn't accept this. Massive protests erupted in Abidjan, with tens of thousands demanding that Gbagbo's victory be recognized. Now, under mounting pressure, Gué fled the capital. Gbagbo was sworn in as president, but the celebrations marked deep fractures. Ouattara's supporters, mostly from the north, had been excluded from this election entirely. They saw Gbagbo's presidency as illegitimate from the very start, and within weeks, clashes broke out between security forces and protesters demanding a new election. The divisions hardened. North against South, Christian against Muslim, Ouattara's RDR against Gbagbo's FPI. Then in September 2002, the fragile peace shattered. While Gbagbo was abroad, mutinous soldiers, many from the north, launched a rebellion. They seized control of the northern half of the country, with Bouaké as their stronghold. The country was effectively split in two overnight. Burkina Faso under Blaise Compaoré was accused of arming and training the rebels, and although France denied backing either side, many Ivorians suspected Paris of quietly favoring the rebellion, given Gbagbo's increasingly nationalist and anti-French stance. France quickly deployed Operation Lycon to enforce a ceasefire and protect foreign nationals, but in doing so, it also froze the front lines, creating a de facto partition. What had begun as a coup to restore democracy has spiraled into a full-blown civil conflict, one in which Côte d'Ivoire's old alliances, foreign ties, and deep social divisions would all come back into play. By late 2002, Côte d'Ivoire was a divided country. Rebel forces calling themselves the New Forces held the Muslim-majority north. President Laurent Gbagbo's government controlled the Christian-majority south and the economic hub of Abidjan. Between them lay a UN-patrolled buffer zone, a reminder that the country's fate was no longer fully in its own hands. The French military under Operation Lycon had intervened quickly after the rebellion began, presenting itself as a neutral peacekeeper. But to many Ivorians, neutrality was hard to believe. Gbagbo's nationalist rhetoric, critical of France's post-colonial influence, clashed with Paris' long-standing interest in the region. Northern rebels were widely seen as closer to France's preferred political outcome, and the French role in freezing the front lines only deepened suspicions. This uneasy stalemate held for 2 years, until November 2004, when everything broke open yet again. Gbagbo's Air Force launched strikes on rebel-held towns. In one raid, Ivorian bombs killed 9 French peacekeepers. Paris responded within hours. French forces destroyed Côte d'Ivoire's entire small air force on the ground, 2 Sukhoi fighter jets and several helicopters, effectively grounding the government's military ambitions. The backlash was immediate. In Abidjan, anti-French protests exploded. Crowds of Gbagbo supporters, especially the militant youth movement known as the Young Patriots, targeted French citizens and businesses. French troops opened fire in some clashes, killing at least 30 Ivorians and wounding many more. Foreign nationals were evacuated by helicopter as Abidjan streets filled with burning barricades and angry chants. For many Ivorians, the events of 2004 were the clearest proof yet that France could still dictate the limits of Ivorian sovereignty. Officially, Paris was acting in self-defense and to prevent escalation. Unofficially, the message was just as clear. Military power could be used to shape political outcomes, just as it had been during the colonial era. Over the next few years, international mediation tried to stitch the country back together. The Marcoussis Accord, brokered in France, and the latter Ouagadougou Agreement, brokered by Burkina Faso, created a power-sharing government. Rebel leader Guillermo Soro became prime minister and elections were promised, but the underlying issues, which are identity, exclusion, and the perception of foreign interference, remained unresolved. By the time Ivorians finally went to the polls in 2010, the fragile peace was already under strain. And the election that was supposed to reunite the country would instead push it into a second and bloodier confrontation, one that would end with foreign troops back on the streets of Abidjan.
Communities have been destroyed, houses have been burnt, there are many corpses still lying in villages, people are still very scared to come back.
After nearly a decade of conflict and fragile peace deals, Ivorians finally went to the polls in 2010. The election was meant to be a turning point, the vote that would reunite the country and close the chapter on years of division. Instead, it would plunge Côte d'Ivoire into its most violent crisis since independence. The race came down to 2 men who had defined the previous decade. Laurent Gbagbo, who was the incumbent president and long-time nationalist figurehead, and this other guy, Alassane Ouattara, the northern-born technocrat and former prime minister who had been barred from running in earlier elections under the discriminatory Ivory Coast rules. In the first round, neither candidate secured a majority, forcing a runoff. Ouattara won key endorsements from former rivals, including Henry Konan Bedi. When the second round votes were counted, the Independent Electoral Commission announced Ouattara as the winner with 54% of the votes. But the Constitutional Council, dominated by Gbagbo's loyalists, annulled results from the north and declared Gbagbo as the victor. This triggered a tense standoff. Both men claimed the presidency and held rival inaugurations, but here was where something decisive happened. Ouattara was recognized internationally by the African Union, the United Nations, and crucially, France and the United States. Gbagbo, backed by sections of the army and the state media, refused to step down. The crisis quickly turned violent. Pro-Ouattara forces, many of them veterans of the Northern Rebellion, clashed with Gbagbo's troops in several cities. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with reports of massacres and targeted killings on both sides. The UN imposed sanctions, of course, and the European Union and United States froze assets linked to Gbagbo's cycle. The most significant blow came from the economy. Ouattara's allies called for a cocoa export ban, a devastating move in a country that was and still is the world's top cocoa producer. Shipping companies suspended operations and government revenue quickly plummeted. Gbagbo's access to funds dried up. By March 2011, Ouattara's forces had launched a full-scale offensive, capturing much of the country. In Abidjan, French and UN troops intervened directly, citing the need to protect civilians. They attacked Gbagbo's military installations and eventually surrounded the presidential residence. On April 11, 2011, Laurent Gbagbo was captured and handed over to Ouattara's forces, an arrest televised to the world. The crisis ended with Ouattara firmly in power, but the scars were deep. The presidency was still being closely controlled by foreign powers. When Alassane Ouattara finally walked into the presidential palace in April 2011, he inherited a country fractured along political, ethnic, and geographical lines. The war was over, but peace was fragile. To cement his authority, Ouattara moved fast, and he had both domestic allies and powerful friends abroad. From the very start, he projected the image of a technocrat ready to rebuild. With a PhD in economics, years at the International Monetary Fund, and close ties to Western capitals, Ouattara was the perfect figure for creditors and investors looking for stability in Côte d'Ivoire. Billions of dollars in international aid and debt relief soon followed, along with infrastructure loans from France, the European Union, and the World Bank. But rebuilding wasn't just about roads and bridges. These foreign powers were here to secure political control. Ouattara's first moves included sidelining rivals and filling key military and administrative posts with loyalists, many of them veterans of the Northern Rebellion that had brought him into power. Rebel leader Guillaume Soro became Speaker of the National Assembly, while former rebel commanders were integrated into the army and security services. Justice after the war was one-sided. While Gbagbo and several of his top allies were sent to The Hague to face charges at the International Criminal Court, pro-Ouattara commanders accused of massacres in the west of the country were rarely prosecuted. For many Ivorians, this reinforced the idea that reconciliation was secondary to consolidating the new regime's power. Economically, Ouattara's Côte d'Ivoire saw growth rates that impressed international observers, sometimes over 8% a year. Foreign investments surged, especially in agribusiness, energy, and construction. But the benefits were uneven. They were usually concentrated in Abidjan's elite circles, while rural poverty persisted. The cocoa industry, still dominated by multinational traders and local political patrons, remained a source of both wealth and corruption. By 2015, Ouattara's grip on power looked unshakable. He won re-election in a landslide, with the main opposition fragmented and weakened. His platform was one of economic transformation, but his political strategy was classic Ivorian power politics: centralized control, reward allies, and manage dissent with a mixture of corruption and repression. Still, even as Ouattara's government projected stability, the seeds of future crises were quietly taking root. Just like those before him, Ouattara began eyeing long-term control of the country. By 2020, Alassane Ouattara had already served 2 terms, the maximum allowed under Côte d'Ivoire's constitution. Publicly, he hinted at stepping down, even grooming his Prime Minister Amadou Gon Coulibaly as his successor. It looked like a carefully managed transition, the kind Côte d'Ivoire hadn't seen in decades. But in July, everything changed. Coulibaly died suddenly of a heart attack just months before the election, and within weeks, Ouattara announced that he would run again, arguing that a new constitution adopted in 2016 had reset the term limit clock. This was seen by Ivorians as a calculated power move that ignored the spirit of the law. The announcement ignited protests across the country. Opposition leaders denounced the decision as unconstitutional, and clashes between demonstrators and security forces left dozens dead in some towns. Old fault lines flared up again, violence along ethnic and regional lines that echoed the crises of the past. The election itself, held in October 2020, was boycotted by major opposition candidates. In many areas, ballot boxes were burned or never delivered. Ouattara officially won with more than 94% of the vote, a margin that spoke less to popularity than to the absence of a real contest. International partners, wary of destabilizing a key regional ally, offered muted criticism. France, the European Union, and ECOWAS called for dialogue, but ultimately recognized Ouattara's victory. For many Ivorians, it confirmed a long-standing truth: foreign governments valued stability over democratic principles, especially in a country that remains the world's top cocoa exporter. The third term cemented Ouattara's dominance, but it also planted the seeds of today's crisis. The precedent had been set. Constitutional rules could be bent, opposition could be sidelined, and elite consensus, not popular will, would decide who ruled Côte d'Ivoire. And that brings us to 2025. Now, Côte d'Ivoire is once again standing at a crossroads. President Alassane Ouattara is 83 years old, but instead of preparing to hand over power, he's gearing up for something unprecedented: a 4th presidential term. The groundwork was laid years ago. In 2016, the constitutional rewrite removed the two-term limit that had existed since the country's democratic transition. In 2020, Ouattara proved he could bend that rule without serious pushback. And now, in 2025, he's taking it further, running again despite mounting calls for political renewal. But this election isn't just about Ouattara's age or ambitions. It's about who is allowed to compete. Several major opposition figures, including former President Laurent Gbagbo and former Prime Minister Guillaume Soro, have been barred from running, either through legal disqualifications, ongoing court cases, or exile. To the government, these are legal matters, but to the opposition, these are just political purges. The move has deepened distrust in the electoral process. Protests have broken out in several cities, with activists accusing the ruling elites of hollowing out democracy. In rural areas where memories of past conflicts remain raw, the exclusion of popular opposition candidates risks reviving the North-South divide that fueled the civil war. Foreign partners are watching closely, but no one expects them to intervene decisively. France and other allies depend on Côte d'Ivoire's stability and its cocoa too much to risk a confrontation with Ouattara's government. Behind closed doors, diplomats talk about inclusive dialogue, but on the ground, many Ivorians see the 2025 election as predetermined. And yet, history has shown that in Côte d'Ivoire, political certainty can unravel overnight. The same networks that have kept Ouattara in power, the old political alliances, the military commanders, the economic patrons, could fracture if the wrong spark is lit. In a country where the secret cabal has always decided who rules, the question now is whether that cabal still speaks with one voice, or whether cracks are beginning to show. From the day Felix Houphouët-Boigny declared independence in 1960, Côte d'Ivoire's story has been shaped by a tight circle of political elites, economic power brokers, and foreign allies. They have survived coups, wars, and constitutional crises, not by winning over the masses, but by holding onto the levers of power that really matter. However, Ivorians today are beginning to fight back. They are actively debating and defining what the next generation of leaders will look like, beyond the shadow of the founding era. The ultimate struggle for Côte d'Ivoire now is to achieve the original promise of independence, a sovereign nation where resources are fairly shared, leaders are accountable, and no external force can override the will of the people. But will all of this be enough come October 2025, or will it be more of the same?